It was 1996, summer, somewhere in Paris. An outdoor movie screen showed an American classic. In Paris in the summertime, there are always free movies shown in parks under the stars, several nights a week. You bring a blanket and a picnic, and you enjoy a great film outdoors. It's one of the nicest pleasures of being in Paris in the summer. And on this particular night, that summer, they showed a movie that first swept the Cannes Film Festival, and then swiftly took over the world. It was a movie by Quentin Tarantino called Pulp Fiction. On that giant screen, that night under the stars in Paris, the movie Pulp Fiction was in its original English with French subtitles. But the French, that crowd didn't need subtitles. They already knew all the dialogue by heart. And on screen was a famous scene between Samuel L. Jackson and John Travolta. It's a scene that every single person there could recite by memory.
You know what they call a quarter pounder with cheese in Paris?
They don't call it a quarter pounder with cheese?
Oh man, they got the metric system. They wouldn't know what the fuck a quarter pounder is.
And what do they call it?
They call it Royale with cheese.
Royale with cheese.
That's right.
What do they call a Big Mac?
Well, Big Mac's a Big Mac, but they call it Le Big Mac.
Le Big Mac. What do they call a Whopper?
I don't know. I didn't go on a Burger King.
French film lovers have always loved American gangster pictures, like Bonnie and Clyde. But Pulp Fiction and Quentin Tarantino, that film was synonymous with a new kind of violence. Gory, bloody, mass murder as wildly inventive entertainment. And borderline addictive. You couldn't look away. You knew it was wrong, and yet it felt so right. And that, of course, was just the beginning. Around this exact same time in the 1990s, French people were developing an appetite for another type of violence, as supersized and as signature American as Le Big Mac, Le Serial Killer. And the man who brought the serial killer to France wasn't some bombastic creative genius like Quentin Tarantino. He was a geeky French dude, a guy in his late 30s named Stéphane Bourgoin, who, among other things, ran a bookshop called Troisième Œil, which is French for third eye. But behind his spectacles and awkward demeanor was a strange and tragic backstory. A man who'd learned about the dark, grotesque, and violent world of serial killers when his wife, Eileen, an American woman, was murdered in Los Angeles back in the 1970s by a serial killer. One would think if someone you loved was murdered so horrifically, you would want as little to do with the subject of serial killers as possible. But Stéphane, he went the other way. He became an expert, the foremost expert in France of serial killers. He boasted encyclopedic knowledge of serial killers in the United States and all over the world throughout history, turning his tragedy into a cottage industry. For 40 years, beginning in 1990, Stéphane would give lectures, publish over 30 books, make documentaries, hold seminars, offering his expertise to authorities in France, Europe, and all over the world. He was single-handedly responsible for educating French people about the world of serial killers. And maybe he trained his devotees too well. Because as we'll learn in this episode, when his fans notice something off with Stefan and his story, they decide to launch their own investigation. A re-examination of everything they thought they knew. And at the heart of his story was the question about what really happened to his dead wife, Eileen. And they'll discover the answer to that question was darker and more twisted than anyone could ever have predicted. In a plot that Tarantino himself could never have dreamed up. This is Dead Sleep, True Crime for Bedtime. I'm Nancy Miller, the creator and host of Dead Sleep, the only true crime podcast that wants to put you to sleep. Each episode features a real-life mystery told more mindfully. No ads, no 911 calls, and no graphic violence. A quick thank you to everyone who is supporting this show. When I first started this show, I was told that I could consider this podcast a success if people listened to between 70 to 80% of each episode. So I was surprised and pleased to see that the figure for this show is more like 200%. Which means the majority of people who listen to this show listen more than once, often twice, maybe even more times than that. So if you're one of those people who listens to episodes more than once and goes back to listen again, maybe to find out what happened at the end because you fell asleep, I'm thrilled. That means this show is exactly what I was hoping it would be. And it would mean a lot to me if you'd support this show with a paid subscription. If everyone who followed this show right now paid for a subscription, we would easily cover the costs of making this series. You can subscribe to the show on Spotify, Patreon, and Apple Podcasts. Your subscription goes right back into making this show the best it can be, which means it helps me pay the small network of independent musicians, engineers, and producers who help me put this show together each week. Tonight's episode is a continuation, part 2, of a previous episode called French Twist. If you haven't heard that episode yet, I recommend it, but it's not required. You can listen to this episode and enjoy it all the same. So with that, let's settle in for the night and get ready as we continue the strange saga of Stefan, the serial killer whisperer, in an episode I'm calling My Bloodiest Regards. It all started in the United States in 1976, America's bicentennial. 200 years of this great nation existing as a democratic republic, marked by the 200th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. It was a time where we yearned to be united, but all around this country, things felt off-kilter, unsettled, and straight up spooky. Ordinary citizens found themselves caught up in extraordinary circumstances beyond their control. Over in Amityville, New York, for instance, a family of 5 made news that year for fleeing their new house, one they'd moved into less than a month earlier, because the family swore the house was haunted by terrifying apparitions and supernatural events. Those events were believed to have a connection to the family who'd been murdered there just 2 years before. A haunting tale that would go on to be the basis for the book and iconic film called Amityville Horror. Elsewhere that year, a young heiress named Patty Hearst was found guilty for her role in a bank robbery in San Francisco. A crime complicated by the fact that she'd been kidnapped and was possibly under the control of a phenomenon called the Stockholm Syndrome. And somewhere in Los Angeles, a young Frenchman named Stefan walked into his apartment and found his wife Eileen killed by a psychopath in what appeared to be a fitful, torturous rage, a life-changing event that Stefan would never forget. Maybe that was the problem. Stefan, he wouldn't forget. As a loved one who'd lost someone to a vicious murder, Stefan was unique. Unique in how much he wanted to know and how deep he was willing to go to find out everything he could. Not just about the serial predator who killed his wife, along with a dozen other women, but about the whole phenomenon of serial killers. After his wife's killer was caught in 1978, Stefan traveled around the country in search of answers. He went to Washington, D.C., and scoured all of the books in the Library of Congress. He went to the Stanford University Library in Northern California to try and find any information on these types of murders. And as he'd later remember it, there was nothing. And Stefan became determined to change that. He was going to find out everything he could about the American serial killer. And to do that, he had to go straight to the source. And by that source, he meant meeting these men, these monsters, face to face. In 1979, he met his first serial killer, a man named Richard Chase, with whom he sat across a table for hours, writing down detail after detail of what Richard Chase did to his victims. It was all gruesome, unbelievable stuff, but he'd written it all down in his notebook and would later publish it in one of his many bestsellers. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Stefan was the #1 serial killer profiler in France. And he claimed to have met over 70 serial killers in person, one-on-one. He was also the rare civilian and the only Frenchman to have ever been given an opportunity to be trained by the FBI. On 2 separate occasions in his career, he did 2 6-month stints studying in the FBI Behavioral Science Unit, the exclusive unit that was pioneered by John E. Douglas of Mindhunter fame. Over the years, Stefan recognized his talent, and he wasn't one to hide his light under a bushel. He often boasted that he had a certain gift for finding a connection with these killers and getting them to talk. And on more than one occasion, he'd even managed to get these men to tell him things they'd never told anyone. The things they told him, they were sickening. Details about their crimes, their feelings about their victims, their disturbing thoughts about the world, and of course, their hatred of people, specifically women. This included coming face to face with the man who'd killed Stefan's own wife. He'd claimed to confront this man in 1986, 10 years after her death. In all of his retelling, however, Stefan appeared to leave out 2 critical details: the name of this killer and the last name, the maiden name of his wife Eileen. Stefan always said it was out of respect for her family. Besides, there were so many others he'd met. He had no shortage of materials for his best-selling books. His books had an unusual tone. Some said they bordered on bad taste, with broad titles like 999 Years of Serial Killers, and another book about a serial killer called Sex Beast. And his books, while comprehensive, didn't have the sophisticated analysis one might expect from an FBI profiler. But perhaps his obsession, he hoped, would give him and the world a definitive insight into why. And the more commercial he made his books, the more he could educate French audiences about the heinous natures of these criminals in America. There was no immediate practical value to this information. At the very least, it made one grateful to live in France and not the United States. As French authorities reminded the French public, serial killers were an American phenomenon. There were no serial killers in France. When Stefan started, the French didn't really have serial killer in their vocabulary. But by the early 2000s, thanks to Stefan, they did. The term was tueur en série, though the phrase le serial killer was still used because these monsters were uniquely and grotesquely American. But there were plenty of true crime fans in France. In the previous episode, you'll recall, a documentarian named Carol had worked with Stefan on a 1992 French documentary. In that doc, they interviewed 3 serial killers in person, 2 in Florida and 1 in California. In America, these 3 men were already famous, and they were about to find a whole new audience in France. You'll also remember from that previous episode that Stefan and the crew traveled to Florida first. Stefan had said he'd interviewed dozens of killers at that time. And of course, he'd trained with the FBI. But this was the first time anyone would be able to watch the monster whisperer in action. And Carol, the producer, couldn't wait to see Stefan interact with these living, breathing monsters and use his skills to reveal fresh insight into why these men behaved as they did. Carol, who was a young woman in her 20s with no background in criminology, she wasn't comfortable being in the same room with these guys. So she didn't attend the interviews with the men in person, but she'd worked closely with Stefan to formulate thoughtful questions. Carol wanted to be careful not to give these guys a public platform for their perversions. But the results, as you'll remember, weren't what Carol expected. Without telling her, Stefan ditched their pre-planned questions and went off script, basically asking these men to retell exactly what they did to these women over and over again. And Stefan appeared to be relishing in the retelling of these details, not as an FBI profiler, but as a fanboy. Later, Stefan would tell people he was horrified by what he'd heard, but Carol witnessed it firsthand. She knew the truth. She knew what she saw. He wasn't horrified. He appeared euphoric. He'd apparently even asked at least one of these killers for their autograph. After that experience, Carol distanced herself from Stefan. There was something wrong with him. Maybe the murder of his wife Eileen had messed with his mind, so much so that he somehow sympathized with these men. Maybe this was part of his catharsis. Was that the method to his madness? Because this was madness. Carol thought along these lines, but in the end she kept her thoughts to herself. And in '92, not long after that documentary, Stefan catapulted into the public eye. And along with that, he'd crank out book after book after book for French audiences. And French people, just like people everywhere, couldn't get enough of these depraved stories. Occasionally, even his most devoted fans were uncomfortable with Stefan and his odd sense of humor. For instance, he tended to wear a shirt with Jeffrey Dahmer's face on it, and he once told fans that he'd bought Dahmer's house in Milwaukee, and he planned to turn the cannibalistic serial killer's home into a vegetarian restaurant. When people recoiled at this statement, he passed it off like it was a joke. And then there was his signature. At his many public appearances and book signings, he wouldn't just sign his name or write "thanks" or "yours truly." Instead, he'd always write, "My bloodiest regards." And whenever someone had doubts about Stefan's strange behavior, he'd always remind them his wife had been murdered. Unless you'd been through the same thing, well, who were you to judge? Stefan had been so prolific and so popular that he educated a whole generation of French people to become true crime enthusiasts, especially the seductive, repulsive pull of les serial killers and their deceptive mind games. Then somewhere in the mid-2000s, things shifted. The rise in true crime and the ever-expanding internet enabled fans of the genre to become their own DIY detectives, amateur sleuths who could search for their so-called favorite serial killer online. And Stefan didn't like this democratization of information, not one bit. Stefan was especially offended by a crop of young women who'd become obsessed with following true crime. In an updated edition of a book called Serial Killers, he lamented the world's infatuation with serial killers. He said he'd lost count of the crazies, in their overwhelming majority, young women who will call or write with appalling requests. One British newspaper article noted how on Facebook, where he had thousands of followers, he'd spar with anyone who'd question his experience. And no matter what they said, in the end, he was the only one whose wife had actually been killed by a serial killer. And that usually shut the conversation down. Around this time in the mid-2000s, YouTube was gaining in popularity. And for the first time, Stefan's fans could watch and rewatch the numerous TV appearances and interviews Stefan had been part of since the 1990s. One of Stefan's biggest fans was a fellow Frenchman named Charles. Charles began to notice what he thought were inconsistencies in some of Stefan's pronouncements. His work tended to cover the same criminals and crimes over and over again, but the specifics, especially as they related to his own interactions with the killers, would change from time to time. On one occasion, Stefan said he interviewed a famous serial killer named Edmund Kemper, only briefly. Then in another interview, he claimed to have spent hundreds of hours with the same man. Stefan spoke of meeting and interviewing 77 serial killers. But at least on YouTube and out there online, Charles could only find video recordings of the interviews that they'd done with the French TV and Carol, and not much else. And then there was the language in some of Stefan's books. Now with so many true crime resources available online, some of the phrasing and some of the encounters seemed similar to the works of other various and more obscure English language writers. But pinning down exact facts, especially in true crime cases, it wasn't always easy to confirm what was fact and what was a little bit of fiction. Then in 2019, trouble really began. Charles stumbled upon a Facebook post about Stefan. It was a link to a television interview in which Stefan once again recounted one of his usual serial killer stories. He had said he'd spent 300 hours with that killer named Ed Kemper. He also talked about the murder of his wife, Eileen. And to Charles's surprise, this time, there were comments from other Facebook members. They were skeptical and critical, casting doubt, for the first time, at least to Charles's mind, where people were wondering if what Stefan was saying was 100% true. Soon after, a smaller group formed, a private group, so they could discuss the doubts that had been raised. And over the course of the next several weeks, this Facebook group became online investigators themselves. Only this time they weren't investigating serial killers or unsolved crimes. They were investigating Stefan himself. They aggregated some of the facts, and a lot of them seemed far-fetched. One time, Stefan said he'd lived next door to Stephen King, which seemed unlikely since Stephen King lived in Maine, not Los Angeles. Another time, he claimed that someone had given him a certain serial killer's mortal remains. This serial killer was actually murdered in prison by a fellow prisoner in 1995. Stefan not only claimed to have bits of his body, he offered pieces, bones and fingernails, to any interested fans. Charles and his little group on Facebook, they weren't sure. Was he joking? It didn't seem like he was joking. This little Facebook group, who would eventually call themselves the Fourth Eye, which was a little wink to Stefan's bookshop, The Third Eye. This small group was spread out all over the world. France, Belgium, Montreal, South America. And together, they began to coordinate a joint investigation into Stefan. Initially, they described their efforts as modest. But the more they dug, the more they found. But to get to the bottom of this case, of what exactly was going on with Stefan, they needed to do what good investigators do. Start at the beginning. Start with the catastrophic catalyst of Stefan's life, the murder of his wife, Eileen. What had really happened to her? Over the years, Stefan had told and retold the story of his wife's murder. And time again, one of the few details he wouldn't reveal was his wife, Eileen's, full given name. He said it was out of respect for her family, and yet Stefan's followers couldn't help but notice he had no qualms about sharing the most disturbing details about what happened to her, how she was killed and where he found her, and the unrecognizable condition of her body. Charles and his fellow investigators, this group called the Fourth Eye, they weren't out to discredit Stefan, but they couldn't help themselves. They were true crime buffs, and their inherent curiosity about crime naturally extended to the criminal profiler himself. If they're going to get to the bottom of who Stefan really was, then they'd have to start with Eileen. They'd have to go back to that night in 1976 and find out what happened to her and the name and identity of the man who killed her, which Stefan had never, ever revealed. What, they wondered, was he really hiding? While reviewing old footage and interviews with Stefan, the group discovered a few key pieces of information that would go a long way in tracking down Stefan's wife's murderer. 1, that Stefan had interviewed this man in person in 1986. 2, that he'd been convicted of not just her murder, but to nearly a dozen other murders that he confessed to doing while he was being interrogated by police when he was apprehended after Eileen's murder. And 3, he'd been given the death penalty. But according to an interview with Stefan, this man was still alive and on death row in a prison somewhere in California. The Fourth Eye group could only hope that this man was still alive. Otherwise, they were about to hit a dead end. And they'd likely never know the truth about what really happened and who Stefan really was. So Charles and the Fourth Eye team started with the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, which maintains a public list of the hundreds of prisoners on death row. In March of 2019, around the time that they were looking into Stefan's claims, there were 737 people on death row. That same year, Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, signed an executive order to impose a moratorium on the death penalty in California, which meant Stefan's wife's killer, he would still be alive. The death row inmate database allows you to search for individuals based on their gender, number of victims, time served, among other data points. When the team searched for Eileen's killer under those search terms, a man who'd killed over a dozen women and had been incarcerated for over 30 years, there was no one who matched those specific circumstances. When that didn't work, they reversed their search. This time, they started with the victim. Over the years, there'd been really only one photograph publicly available of Eileen. It was a sweet photo of Stefan and Eileen enjoying a kiss. And in that photo, Eileen had short blonde hair, an upturned nose, a distinct smile with 2 prominent front teeth. Again, the Fourth Eye team searched every victim database in California. This was hours and hours, weeks of work. And nothing. They didn't know who this woman in the photo was, but they knew who she wasn't. She wasn't Stefan's dead wife, Eileen. She wasn't a tragic victim of a serial killer spree in California. She hadn't been murdered by a serial killer, or by Stefan, or by anyone else, because they were quite confident that Eileen didn't exist. At first, they didn't want to believe it to be true, because it would mean that Stefan's whole origin story, it would be all a lie. And if that was all a lie, what else has Stefan lied about? And this is where things take a stunning turn. Because in his career, Stefan claimed to have interviewed 77 serial killers, including some of the most notorious names in U.S. history. Son of Sam, BTK, the Green River Killer. They couldn't rely on Stefan to tell them the truth. So, to get to the bottom of this, they had to enlist the help of the least likely people in the world. The serial killers themselves. First up was a serial killer whose moniker was BTK. They wrote to BTK in prison, and they asked him, had he ever had an interview with a Frenchman named Stéphane Bourgoin. BTK himself wrote back on a piece of stationery that they would actually say smelled like perfume. And in that letter, BTK was clear. He'd never heard of the guy. Next up was the serial killer known as Son of Sam. Son of Sam is still alive and in prison in New York State. And in his writings, Stefan had claimed that he, and he alone, had managed to get Son of Sam to admit specific details around his case. Details that no one had ever heard before. Details that were a stunning revelation that the criminal himself wouldn't likely forget telling someone So again, Charles and his team wrote to Son of Sam. Did he have any recollection of being interviewed by a Frenchman? Once again, they received a letter back from Son of Sam himself. Nope, he said, never heard of the guy. No Frenchman. They went down the list, one killer after another, 30 serial killers in all. And outside of the handful that had been interviewed on tape, including that documentary from 1992, no one remembered being interviewed by a Frenchman. Charles Manson was also on their list. Manson was dead by then. He'd died in 2017, and it was 2019. But Charles and the team were in touch with one of Manson's remaining devotees, who went by the name Grey Wolf. Stefan's story about Manson had been vivid, right down to how exactly Manson sat in his chair while Stefan interviewed him. According to Grey Wolf, who was Manson's historian, there was no record of such an encounter. Well, more accurately, there was no record of that encounter with Stefan Bourgoin. There was, however, a pretty close version of those events in the life of another criminal profiler, John E. Douglas, from the book Mindhunter. Mindhunter, the book, was initially published all the way back in 1995, but it wasn't well known in France at that time. However, Netflix released a series based on Mindhunter, and it was wildly popular in the United States and also in France. And in that series, there's a scene that was exactly like what Stefan had described. Only Charles knew that it happened to John Douglas, not Stefan. So Charles and the Fourth Eye Group wrote to John Douglas to ask about Stefan's claims, which included Stefan's assertion that he was the only Frenchman, the only civilian, to have trained as a criminal profiler at the FBI, that elite unit that John Douglas had pioneered. They didn't expect to hear from him. By then, he was hugely famous. Much to his surprise, John Douglas wrote back. And when he did, he summed up Stefan in 2 words: delusional and imposter. A fraud who gleaned his expertise by reading Mindhunter and other books, and co-opted those stories, passing them off as his own. Stefan Bourgoin was single-handedly responsible for introducing France to true crime, cultivating a national cultural obsession. As one of his unmaskers put it, without his work, we never would have gotten interested in serial killers in the first place. It's ironic. In a way, it's thanks to his own work that we ended up catching him. So who was Stefan Bourgoin really? Stefan did live in the United States, but he didn't live in LA. He lived in New York City, where he worked part-time in the porn industry. He never trained with the FBI, and most of his books were plagiarized from other authors. This included his assertion that he'd cracked the Black Dahlia case, arguably the most famous unsolved murder case in American true crime history, that he'd stolen from a book that was published in the early 90s as well. And it's likely that the 3 interviews he did for that 1992 documentary, including those 2 interviews in Florida and the 1 interview in California, it was likely those were the first interviews he'd ever done with any serial killer in his entire life. When news of this fraud surfaced, Stefan took to Facebook. In February 2020, he posted to his thousands of fans that he was a victim of a campaign of cyber harassment and hatred, and he swiftly discredited his detractors. Have all of these accusers and informers met even one single serial killer, he asked? Had they organized international conferences or been invited to appear on several hundred television shows? Had they sold out theaters in 26 cities on their 2019 speaking tour? Of course not, he said. Then, with a dramatic flourish, he signed off of Facebook and said he'd be offline until further notice. It would take a while for Stefan to come clean, or as clean as possible. In an interview he did with Paris Match, the way he described what happened was he was suffering from a condition called mythomania. Mythomania is the pathological need to make things up. And in fact, throughout that interview, it seemed he couldn't decide what the truth was and what the truth wasn't. So who was that woman in the photo? The blonde with the upturned nose and the prominent front teeth? According to Stefan, who swore he was telling the truth, that woman was a sex worker, a woman that he'd frequented a few times when he was in Florida on vacation back in the 1970s. He claimed that this woman had actually been a victim of a serial killer, and her death would, in part, inspire him to launch this scheme. But it's impossible to know if he was telling the truth. Soon after he did an interview with Paris Match where he appeared to come clean, he recanted just about everything he said and continues to assert that he's an expert in his field. And that's the strange part. He's not wrong. When his deceptions were exposed, authorities in France who had worked with Stefan had said he could have pretty much had the same career. He was the foremost expert of serial killers. He was a walking encyclopedia. Maybe he hadn't been trained by the FBI, but he didn't necessarily need to be. He could have written the same books, consulted on the same projects, still been famous in France without those embellishments. Oh, and there's one last twist to this story. There are serial killers in France, and in fact, the entire time that Stefan was pretending to be interviewing American serial killers, he could have been investigating a very real case of a string of killings, a series of mysterious disappearances that would only be solved decades later. The killer would be known as the Ogre of Ardennes, and how he was caught? That's a whole other story for a whole other night on a whole different episode of Dead Sleep, True Crime for Bedtime. Thank you for listening, and I'll be back next week with an all-new true crime story and a bonus episode that I'm working on right now. I'm excited to share this month. Until then, night-night.